Корсиканец презирает меня. После Аустерлица он считает меня ничтожным генералом. Подожди, я сам. А между тем это в его войсках полный разбал боевого духа и военной дисциплины. Ладно, воспользуемся этим. Пошли.
As soon as he is named, Kutuzov brings out the patriotism among his troops. Comrades, he writes, do your duty. Think of the sacrifices of your towns brought down in flames and your children begging for your protection. Think of your Emperor Alexander, your leader, who sees you as the embodiment of his power. While the Tsar's army reorganizes itself in a decisive manner, Napoleon demands his men push themselves ever harder. Rest is not worthy of them. Gusts of wind throw up whirlwinds of torturous burning dust. The speed at which they must travel means many horses are lost. And while typhus tears through the troops, Russian propaganda attacks the most vulnerable. French soldiers, you are forced to march against us. They say you are fighting for peace. Don't believe these perfidious words. You are fighting for the insatiable mission for a leader who does not seek peace, and for whom the blood of young men is a mere trifle. Go home, there's still time. These calls for desertion and harassment aim to weaken the Grande Armée, to be able to attack it better. In 2 months, it shrinks radically, because in addition to the sick, the slain, the injured, and the deserters, some units have had to stay behind to hold Vilnius and Smolensk. But nothing stops their progress. Cavalry and infantry keep moving day and night in the hope of reaching the invisible enemy. Every day, this war seems ever more absurd to Caulaincourt, who rebels. We are destroying each other with no result other than gaining ground. But due to the ground gained, Moscow is now just 3 days' march away. Public opinion has pushed Kutuzov's back to the wall. In Borodino, 75 miles from the sacred city, he tries to stop Napoleon. The terrain is rolling and wooded, which slows down the enemy's progression. Kutuzov establishes his defensive line on the southern bank of the Kalosha River, blocking the route to Moscow. He sets up 4 redoubts. The first and biggest of them is the Raevsky redoubt. Then come the 2 more modest Bagration redoubts, and the last one is the Shevardino redoubt as a frontal buffer. A redoubt is an earth fortification constructed like a hillock where a series of cannon are installed. It's defended from below by a trench of soldiers. Behind, there's a massive concentration of Russian troops.
Kutuzov has placed his forces defensively here. He thinks he's protected behind this river, protected by his redoubts. We'll start first by taking the Shevardino redoubt and the village of Borodino. Then we'll be able to position our troops for the final battle. Our northern armies will be inserted here to prevent the Russian army from surrounding us. There you have it.
$140,000 men in the Grande Armée against 110,000 Russians. 214 infantry battalions against 180. 317 cavalry squadrons against 20 Cossack regiments. 587 cannon against 624. The sound of cannon fire creates great joy for the French and a strange relief because they're certain this time that the Russians have not decamped. The 2 armies are to fight in 2 highly strategic areas: the village of Borodino on the road to Moscow and the Shevardino redoubt, an essential barrier in the Russian defensive line. In less than an hour, more than 10,000 men are wounded or killed. This is a bloody prelude to the main battle, an attack that will allow the Grande Armée to tackle the Russian resistance. Even when they're wounded, far from calling for help, they refuse to give up and seem determined to die where they've fought. But their bravery is not enough. The French take the Shevardino redoubt. Despite heavy losses, the first step in Napoleon's plan is a success. Each army dresses its wounds. The Russians are reinforcing their defensive lines, and the Raevski and Bagration redoubts in particular. Kutuzov is organizing a solemn procession with the Virgin of Smolensk. Pamphil Nazarov, like his companions, prays for divine protection. His thoughts turn to his family. But he cannot say this, as one must be ready to die for God, the Tsar, and Russia. The Russians have never prayed with as much fervor as they did today, wrote the poet Glinka. In these hours, our hearts and souls are having secret conversations with divinity. While the enemy puts itself in God's hands, the Grande Armée, which has never lost faith in Napoleon, waits impatiently for the next morning. The Emperor has slept badly.
Caulaincourt. Thank you.
He went to bed at 3 a.m., worried that the Russians might disappear once again. But when he emerges from his tent, he is confident once again. The first light of dawn reminds him of the sunshine at Austerlitz. The previous evening, he redrew his battle plans. He wants to defeat the southern flank of the enemy forces, to attack the redoubtable fortifications constructed by the Russians, and the great Raevski redoubt in particular. The Emperor's Imperial Guard will stay back, ready to intervene if necessary.
Soldiers, this is the battle we wished for so long. Now, our victory depends on you. We need it. It will bring you wealth, land, and ensure we will soon be home. Fight as you fought in Austerlitz. Your efforts will go down in history, and they will say, he was there at that great battle at the gates of Moscow.
For 10 hours, the armies fight hand to hand. One forgets one's fear under the deluge of bullets, cannonballs, and shells. One barely notices one's comrades as they fall, struck down at point-blank range. The Russians will call it the Battle of Borodino. The French will talk of the Battle of Moscova. Positions are taken, lost, taken back, and lost again. The 2nd Cavalry Corps of General Montbrun must now charge to the right of the Raevski redoubt. Montbrun is looking for the right position from which to attack. He heads off on a reconnaissance mission by horse, but unfortunately is hit in the chest by a cannonball. Napoleon then decides to replace him with Auguste de Caulaincourt, the brother of Armand. The Russian infantry, destabilized by the fatal wounding of General Bagration, pulls itself together and redoubles its efforts to regain lost ground. The actors in this carnage speak of hell, of a burning sky, of the apocalypse, and cannon spitting death. Caulaincourt suddenly has a terrible premonition. At 3 p.m., his brother, Auguste, at the head of the 5th Regiment of Cuirassiers, supported by 2 divisions and 2 infantry battalions, makes an assault on the great Raevski redoubt. The Russians must beat a retreat. The wounded beg to be put out of their misery and be relieved of their terrible suffering. The Russians abandon their positions, but their army has not been annihilated. The battle was hellish, but if there is to be a winner, there must also be a loser.
I think it's very difficult to evaluate the results of the Battle of Borodino, because Napoleon and Kutuzov each had their own objectives, and neither Napoleon nor Kutuzov achieved them. Napoleon's aim was to totally defeat the Russian army. Kutuzov's aim was to stop the French and to protect Moscow.
What did it mean to win a battle at that time? One might say that the winner is the army that is in control of the battlefield. If that's the case, then there was a clear winner at the Battle of Moscova, because the Russians withdrew and the French stayed in control of the terrain. Therefore, Napoleon won the Battle of Moscova. It is true that in strategic terms, the Battle of Moscova weakened the Grand Army, and that's why the Russians claim it as a victory. Everyone might agree if we said that the French won the Battle of Moscova and the Russians didn't lose the Battle of Borodino.
It's a disappointing victory for Napoleon and so costly in terms of human life. But the Imperial Guard, the elite of the Grande Armée, stayed back. Sergeant Bourgogne thus watched the battle from a distance, unlike so many of his compatriots who found themselves in the front line. Napoleon was prudent, too prudent perhaps, and didn't want to take the risk of weakening his guard. But if he had sent Bourgogne and his men into the melee, the victory might perhaps have been greater. Lives might have been saved. Bourgogne's companions might have gone home safe and sound. So many heroes, soldiers, officers, and generals. Caulaincourt will never forget that gruesome day.
We will triumph, or I shall kill myself, were the last words Auguste said to me. He had led the decisive charge against the great redoubt. Did he have the time to enjoy it before being killed by an enemy bullet? For the Emperor, France had lost one of its best officers, but I had lost a brother. He was 35 years old.
Help me! Help me!
During this dreadful day, 120,000 cannonballs and 300,000 cartridges were fired, resulting in a terrible loss of human life. 45,000 Russians died, were injured or gone, more than a third of the troops. Napoleon lost 28,000 men. This slaughter pushes the medical services to their limits. Many injured people are left on the battlefield without help. In the Grande Armée, there is one doctor and one pharmacist for every 600 soldiers. 45 surgeons care for victims on both sides. It takes less than 4 minutes to amputate a leg. 10,000 wounded beyond help are left in the surrounding villages where most of them will die. Napoleon then waits for the following day's hostilities, but Kutuzov has another idea.
Why did Kutuzov not continue the battle the following day as he had promised? At the end of the battle, he gave orders to attack Napoleon's troops the following morning. But later on that night, he gave an order that was totally contrary: to withdraw. The most likely reason was that he had received information in the meantime regarding losses in the Russian army. And these losses were terrible.
Kutuzov spends a long time with his generals, weighing up the pros and cons of a new fight eventually admitting that his troops aren't strong enough to stop Napoleon and that it will be better to spare them and take some time to find reinforcements. 420,000 soldiers crossed the Niemen River 3 months earlier. Now, just half of them remain. They came from France, Spain, and Italy. They'd traveled over 2,500 miles, crossed the Alps or the Pyrenees, and traveled through Germany, Poland, and Western Russia. At last, they think they're going to get the rest they desperately need. But Napoleon remains convinced that the arrival of the Grande Armée at the gates of Moscow will be the coup de grâce that will force Alexander to negotiate. Sergeant Bourgogne remembers. After having crossed through a big forest, we finally caught our first glimpse of Moscow. And in moments like these, one forgets everything. The dangers, the fatigue, the comrades lost, and only one thing counts: the pleasure of entering the promised land. But Napoleon, who dreamed of entering the city as a conquering hero, like in Vienna and Berlin, discovers that Moscow has been abandoned, and no public figure is going to come and hand him the keys to the city. Only those who had neither the money nor the time to flee remain. Napoleon moves into the Kremlin with his guard and his services in attendance. His generals occupy the luxury homes of the Moscow nobility.
Where are our divisions?
Sir, fires have been started all across the city. It seems that it was the Russians
No, I don't believe it. These barbarians can't possibly be so crazy as to destroy Moscow.
There are no fire engines left. They took them all.
Then find the arsonists. And we'll hang them when we do.
First, they believe the fires are accidental, set by drunken soldiers celebrating their first night in Moscow.
Засыпай порох, сейчас все подорвем.
But it soon becomes clear that these fires are no accident. Dozens of arsonists are scattered around the city. Who are they? And who is giving orders to create this inferno?
Stop there! Catch them! Is anyone there?
Sergeant, I think we found some treasure.
Don't get ahead of yourself. Get down!
Kutuzov chose to abandon Moscow to avoid a new confrontation and to reorganize his troops. That is why the Governor-General of the city, Count Rostopchin, left to his own devices, orders reprisals by burning warehouses, storerooms, and palaces. Nothing is to be left to the invading forces.
Is everyone okay?
Yes, Sergeant.
Sergeant Bourgogne remembers. When the explosion happened, we thought we were dead, annihilated under the debris. The Russians didn't care how they tried to destroy us.
Are you wounded, Sergeant?
It's nothing.
Where are we? This is where we should sleep.
You're too ugly and you smell too bad to sleep in a palace. Sergeant, come and look. What do we do with it, Sergeant?
We take it. Look out! It's all collapsing. Let's get out of here. Come on.
Danger is everywhere. Napoleon's Grande Armée has fallen into a burning trap. Surrounded by flames and blinded, they still dream of victory.